Have you ever wondered what it feels like to wake up in complete darkness? Unable to move, unable to scream, trapped in what should be your final resting place? I have, because I lived it. My name is Catherine Elizabeth Thornwood, and I was buried alive. But this isn't just a story about a near-death experience. This is about the gardener who refused to let them put me in the ground, about the signs everyone else ignored, and about the terrifying reality that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who get it catastrophically wrong. What happened to me could happen to anyone, and by the time you finish hearing my story, you'll never look at death the same way again. Let me take you back to that day, the day I died, except I didn't. The day was September 14th, and the morning started like any other morning in the Thornwood estate. I woke up in my canopy bed, surrounded by silk sheets that cost more than most people's cars, in a room that overlooked the gardens my family had maintained for 3 generations. I was 28 years old, healthy, vibrant, planning my engagement party for the following month. I had everything anyone could want: wealth, beauty, a man who adored me, and a future that stretched out before me like an endless golden road. But life has a cruel way of reminding us that nothing is guaranteed, that everything can change in a heartbeat, literally. That morning, I felt different. There was a heaviness in my chest, a strange tingling in my fingers that I attributed to sleeping in an awkward position. I dismissed it. I was young, I was healthy, I had a personal trainer, a nutritionist, and access to the best healthcare money could buy. What could possibly go wrong? I went downstairs for breakfast, and that's when things started to deteriorate rapidly. My mother noticed immediately that something was off. She said I looked pale, that my lips had a bluish tint. I laughed it off, told her she was being dramatic, that I just needed coffee. But the truth was, I could feel it too. Something was very wrong. My heart was racing, but at the same time, everything felt slow, like I was moving through honey. The room started to spin, and I remember gripping the edge of the dining table, my knuckles turning white. My mother screamed for help, and the last thing I remember before everything went black was my father's face, twisted in panic, as he caught me before I hit the marble floor. When I came to, I was in my bed, surrounded by doctors. Our family physician, Dr. Heiress, a man who had known me since I was a child, was there along with 2 specialists. They were talking in hushed tones, using words I couldn't quite grasp. My body felt strange, disconnected, like it belonged to someone else. I tried to speak, to tell them I was awake, but nothing came out. My lips wouldn't move, my eyes wouldn't open. I was trapped inside my own body, a prisoner in flesh and bone that refused to obey me. I could hear everything. Every word, every whisper, every sob from my mother in the corner of the room. Dr. Heiress was saying something about my heart, about an undiagnosed condition, about how my vitals were failing. I wanted to scream that I was still here, that I was listening, that I wasn't ready to go, but my body betrayed me. The paralysis was complete and absolute. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. I couldn't tell anymore. Time became meaningless in that darkness. I felt them examining me, checking for vital signs, and I could sense their growing despair. At some point, I heard Dr. Heiress say the words that would seal my fate. "I'm sorry. There's nothing more we can do. She's gone." Gone? I wasn't gone. I was right here, screaming inside my own head, begging them to look harder, to check again, to not give up on me. But they couldn't hear me. No one could hear me. The silence that followed his pronouncement was deafening. My mother's wails cut through the air like knives, and I felt the weight of their grief crushing down on me like a physical force. My father, always so strong and composed, broke down completely. I heard him sobbing, pleading with God to take him instead, and all I could do was lie there, helpless, unable to comfort them, unable to tell them the truth. The next thing I became aware of was movement. They were moving my body, preparing me for what comes next. I felt cold hands on my skin, washing me, dressing me in what I assumed was my burial gown. The feeling was surreal, horrifying beyond description. Imagine being fully conscious while people prepare your corpse. Imagine the terror of knowing what's coming next. They were going to bury me. They were going to put me in a box and lower me into the ground, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. Have you ever experienced true primal fear? The kind that makes your blood run cold and your mind scream for escape? That's where I was, trapped in that nightmare, knowing that unless something miraculous happened, I would spend my last conscious moments 6 feet under, suffocating in darkness and silk lining. The funeral preparations happened around me in a blur of activity. I could hear people coming and going, bringing flowers, paying their respects. I could smell the roses, my favorite flower, now the scent of my own funeral. Friends came to say goodbye, touching my hand, crying over my body. Each touch was torture because I could feel it, every single one. I could feel their tears falling on my skin. I could feel their lips pressing against my forehead in final kisses, and I couldn't respond. I couldn't squeeze back. I couldn't let them know that I was still in here, still fighting, still hoping for someone, anyone, to realize the terrible mistake that was being made. The viewing was the worst part. They had placed me in an ornate mahogany casket, lined with white satin that felt suffocatingly soft against my skin. I could hear the constant shuffle of feet, the whispered condolences, the crying that seemed to go on forever. My fiancé, James, spent hours beside the casket. I could hear him talking to me, telling me about the life we should have had, the children we would never have, the future that was stolen from us. His voice was broken, raw with grief, and it shattered something deep inside me. If I could have cried, I would have flooded that casket with tears, but even that release was denied to me. I was aware of everything but capable of nothing. Among all the visitors, there was one person whose presence felt different. Thomas Bennett, our estate gardener. He had worked for our family for 15 years, ever since I was 13 years old. Thomas was a quiet man, in his early 50s, with weathered hands and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He had taught me about plants when I was younger, about how to tell when something was truly dead versus just dormant. He had shown me that sometimes things that appear lifeless are simply waiting, conserving energy, preparing to bloom again. When Thomas approached my casket, something shifted. I couldn't see him, but I could sense a difference in his energy. He didn't cry like the others. He didn't offer platitudes. Instead, he stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity. Then I felt something strange. His hand touched mine, and unlike the others, he didn't pull away quickly. He held it, and I swear I felt his fingers pressing against my wrist, searching. Was he checking for a pulse? Did he suspect something? Hope flared in my chest, desperate and painful. Please, Thomas, please notice. Please see what the doctors missed. But he said nothing, and eventually he moved away. The hope that had sparked so brightly began to dim again. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was so desperate for rescue that I was reading meaning into meaningless gestures. The night before my burial was the longest night of my life. The funeral home was quiet, empty except for me and the darkness. I was alone with my thoughts, with my terror, with the knowledge that when morning came, they would close the lid of this casket, and I would never see light again. I tried everything I could think of to move, to make a sound, to do anything that might alert someone to my condition. I focused all my energy on my fingers, trying to twitch them, trying to create any movement at all. Nothing. My body remained stubbornly still, a beautiful corpse that housed a screaming soul. I thought about my life, about all the things I had taken for granted, the feel of sunshine on my face, the taste of my morning coffee, the sound of rain on the windows, my mother's laugh, my father's terrible jokes, James's kisses. All of it was slipping away, and I was powerless to hold on to any of it. Morning came, announced by the sounds of people arriving, making final preparations. I heard my mother's voice, fragile and broken, asking if I looked peaceful. Someone assured her that I did, that I looked like I was sleeping. If only they knew. If only they could hear the screaming inside my head. They closed the casket lid, and the darkness became complete. The little bit of light that had filtered through my eyelids was gone now, replaced by absolute blackness. The sounds became muffled, distant. I felt the casket being lifted, carried, placed into what I assumed was the hearse. The drive to the cemetery was surreal. Every bump in the road jostled my body slightly, a reminder that I was still somehow present in this flesh that everyone believed was empty. I could hear the muffled sound of the engine, the occasional horn from another car. Normal life continuing while mine was ending. When we arrived at the cemetery, I felt the casket being carried again. I could hear the crunch of gravel under the pallbearer's feet, the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was a beautiful day, I realized. I could feel the warmth of the sun through the wood of the casket, a beautiful day to be buried alive. The priest began the service, his voice carrying that particular cadence that clergy use for funerals. I had heard it before at other services, never imagining I would be the subject of such a ceremony. He spoke about my life, about my kindness, my generosity, my bright future cut short. Each word felt like a nail in my coffin, quite literally. My mother was sobbing openly now, supported by my father, who was trying to be strong for her. I could hear James's voice breaking as he read a eulogy he had written. The words were beautiful, poetic, filled with love and loss. They were also premature, but he didn't know that. None of them knew. The service continued, prayers were said, hymns were sung, and then came the moment I had been dreading. I felt the casket being lifted again, positioned over what I knew was my grave. This was it. This was really happening. In moments, they would lower me into the ground, cover me with earth, and leave me there to suffer a death more horrible than anyone should have to endure. The mechanism began to lower the casket, and I felt myself descending into the grave. This was the end. There was no hope left, no chance of rescue, no miracle coming to save me. I was going into the ground and I would die there, alone and terrified, buried alive because of a medical mistake. And then everything stopped. The casket jerked to a halt mid-descent and I heard shouting. Confused, angry voices raised above the quiet solemnity of the funeral. What was happening? Why had they stopped? Someone was yelling about desecration, about respect for the dead, about calling security. But there was another voice, insistent and urgent, cutting through the protests. It was Thomas. Thomas the gardener, the quiet man who had checked my pulse at the viewing, was causing a scene at my burial. "Stop this right now!" he was shouting, his normally soft voice raised in desperation. "She's not dead. I'm telling you, she's alive." The crowd erupted. Some people were angry at the disruption, calling it disrespectful and crazy. Others sounded confused, asking what he meant, how he could possibly know. My father's voice rose above the others, demanding an explanation. "Thomas, what are you talking about? The doctors certified her death. What could you possibly have seen that they missed?" "Mr. Thornwood, please, I'm begging you," Thomas pleaded, and I could hear the raw desperation in his voice. "I've been around death my whole life. Plants, animals, I know the difference between dead and dormant. Yesterday, at the viewing, I checked her pulse. It was there, sir. Faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. And there are other signs. Her skin? It's not the right color for someone who's been dead for 2 days. There's no rigor mortis, no lividity in the expected patterns. Please, I'm not crazy. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just can't stand here and let you bury her alive." The silence that followed was profound. I could almost feel the weight of everyone's shock, their uncertainty. Then Dr. Harrison's voice cut in, clinical and dismissive. "Thomas, I appreciate your concern, but I assure you I checked thoroughly. Catherine has no pulse, no respiration, no brain activity. She's gone. Sometimes grief can make us see things that aren't there, make us hope for impossibilities. Then open the casket and prove me wrong." Thomas shot back, his voice breaking with emotion. "If I'm wrong, I'll apologize to the family, I'll leave, I'll never work in this town again. But if there's even the slightest chance I'm right, can you live with yourself knowing you buried her alive? Can any of you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could hear people murmuring, debating. Some thought Thomas had lost his mind. Others seemed less certain. The moment stretched out, agonizing in its tension. Then my mother's voice, small and desperate, broke through. "Open it, please. I need to know. I need to be sure." There was resistance, arguments about dignity and closure, but my mother was insistent. Thomas had planted a seed of doubt, and she couldn't let it go. She had to know. I heard the mechanisms engaging, felt the casket being raised back up. There was the sound of the locks being undone, and then light flooded in as the lid was lifted. I couldn't see it. My eyes still refused to open, but I could sense it, feel the warmth on my face. The crowd gasped collectively. "Look at her skin," Thomas said urgently. "Look at the color. Look at her chest. Watch for any movement, no matter how slight." Dr. Harrison was there. I could hear him close by, probably examining me again. "I don't see anything," he said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "Wait," someone else said, another doctor perhaps. Did her chest just move?" "It's probably just settling," Dr. Harrison argued, but he sounded uncertain now. No, there it is again," the other voice insisted. "It's shallow, incredibly shallow, but that's definitely respiration. My God, Thomas is right. She's breathing." The explosion of activity that followed was chaotic. Suddenly, there were hands everywhere. People checking vitals, shouting for medical equipment, calling for an ambulance. My mother was crying, but these were different tears now. Tears of desperate hope rather than grief. Someone was putting an oxygen mask over my face, and I felt the rush of pure oxygen flooding my lungs. It was the most beautiful sensation I had ever experienced. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I began to feel things changing. The paralysis that had gripped me started to ease just fractionally. My finger twitched. It was the smallest movement, barely visible, but to me it felt like moving a mountain. I had control again, even if just a tiny bit. "Did you see that? Her finger moved," someone exclaimed. They were all watching now. These people who had been about to bury me, watching for any sign of life. I focused all my energy on that finger, managed to move it again, more deliberately this time. Then another finger. Then, with what felt like superhuman effort, I managed to flutter my eyelids. "Catherine! Catherine, can you hear me?" My mother's voice, so close now, filled with desperate hope. "If you can hear me, try to move your fingers again." I did. I moved them, and the sob of joy that escaped my mother's lips was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. My father was there too. I could hear him praying, thanking God, his voice thick with emotion. The ambulance arrived with sirens blaring, and I was being loaded onto a stretcher, still mostly paralyzed, but definitely, undeniably alive. As they wheeled me away, I heard Thomas's voice one more time, quiet and relieved. Thank God. Thank God I trusted my instincts. The hospital became my home for the next 3 weeks. The diagnosis, when it finally came, explained everything and nothing all at once. I had suffered from a condition called catalepsy, a rare neurological disorder that can create a state of suspended animation so profound that even trained medical professionals can mistake it for death. It's incredibly rare, affecting perhaps 1 in a million people, and it can be triggered by extreme stress or certain underlying conditions. In my case, it was caused by an undiagnosed autoimmune disorder that had been slowly building in my system, waiting for the right trigger to manifest catastrophically. The doctors explained that during a cataleptic episode, the body's metabolic functions slow to such an extraordinary degree that heartbeat and respiration become nearly undetectable. Muscle rigidity sets in. The person becomes completely unresponsive to stimuli, and by all conventional medical tests, they appear dead. Throughout history, the medical literature is filled with terrifying cases of people being buried alive due to catalepsy. People who woke up in their coffins and died horrible deaths clawing at the lids, their screams unheard beneath 6 feet of earth. I had come within minutes of joining their ranks. The neurologist who treated me, Dr. Aish, Sarah Chen, was fascinated by my case from a medical standpoint, though she was appropriately sympathetic to the trauma I had endured. She explained that what saved me was the relatively short duration of my episode and the oxygen-rich environment of the casket, which ironically was designed to be airtight but wasn't perfectly sealed. If I had been buried, if Thomas hadn't intervened, I would have either suffocated within hours or, potentially worse, emerged from the cataleptic state while buried, only to die of suffocation while fully conscious and aware of my situation. The thought still gives me nightmares. As sensation slowly returned to my body over those first few days in the hospital, the experience was both wonderful and agonizing. Imagine not being able to feel anything, then suddenly feeling everything all at once. Every nerve ending seemed hypersensitive. The scratch of the hospital sheets felt like sandpaper. The fluorescent lights were blinding even through my eyelids. The ambient sounds of the hospital, machines beeping, people talking, footsteps in the hallway were overwhelming. But I was alive. I was breathing on my own. I could move my eyes, then my fingers, then my hands. Each small victory was celebrated by my family and the medical team. My mother never left my side those first few days, holding my hand, talking to me constantly, as if afraid that if she stopped, I might slip away again. My father tried to be strong, but I caught him crying more than once when he thought I was sleeping. James was there too, devoted and loving, but I could see the trauma in his eyes. He had mourned me, said goodbye to me, started to imagine a future without me. Now he had to readjust to a reality where I was back, where we had a future again, but where the specter of death had been so close that it had left its mark on both of us. The person I most wanted to see was Thomas, the gardener who had saved my life, who had trusted his instincts over medical degrees and certifications, who had been brave enough to cause a scene at a funeral, to face ridicule and anger, all because he believed I deserved a chance. They brought him to see me on my 4th day in the hospital, when I could finally speak, though my voice was raspy and weak from disuse. He stood in the doorway, awkward and uncertain, his weathered hands twisting his cap. "Thomas," I managed to say, and his eyes immediately filled with tears. "You saved my life. I couldn't let them bury you, Miss Catherine," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I've seen enough of death to know what it looks like, and you didn't look like that. You looked like the roses in winter, dormant but not dead." just waiting for the right conditions to wake up. I asked him later, when I had more strength, what had made him so certain enough to risk his reputation, his job, the anger of my family and everyone at that funeral. He told me it was a combination of things. The color of my skin, which was pale but not the waxy gray of death. The lack of true rigor mortis. The faint warmth he had detected when he held my hand at the viewing. But mostly, he said, it was something he couldn't quite explain. An intuition built from decades of working with living things, of understanding the subtle difference between death and dormancy. I've seen plants that everyone thought were dead come back to life, he explained. I've seen animals that appeared deceased suddenly take a breath. Nature has taught me that death isn't always what it appears to be, that sometimes what looks like an ending is just a pause. And when I looked at you, something told me you were paused, not ended. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to make them see it. His humility was astounding. He had saved my life, literally pulled me from my grave, and he acted as though he had simply done what anyone would do. But we both knew that wasn't true. Most people would have deferred to the doctors, to the experts, to the official pronouncement of death. Most people wouldn't have had the courage to cause a scene, to insist on being heard, to fight for someone who appeared beyond fighting for. Thomas was extraordinary, and I would spend the rest of my life grateful for his extraordinary gift of observation and courage. The media got hold of the story, of course. Heiress buried alive, saved by Gardner, made headlines around the world. We became a sensation, a modern-day miracle story. Reporters camped outside the hospital, wanting interviews, wanting details, wanting to turn my trauma into entertainment. My family, with my blessing, issued a brief statement confirming the basic facts and asking for privacy while I recovered. But the attention was relentless. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, wanted to sensationalize the horror I had endured. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand unless they had lived through it, was the profound psychological impact of the experience. I had been conscious during my own funeral. I had heard my loved ones say goodbye. I had felt myself being lowered into my grave. I had lived every person's worst nightmare, and while my body was recovering, my mind was struggling to process the trauma. The nightmares started almost immediately. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that casket, feeling it descend into the earth, hearing the first shovelful of dirt hit the lid. I would wake up screaming, clawing at the air, convinced I was still buried. The hospital staff was wonderful, providing psychological support along with the physical treatment, but some wounds don't heal quickly. Dr. Chen explained that I was experiencing a form of PTSD, which was entirely normal given what I had been through. She connected me with a therapist who specialized in trauma, and slowly, painfully, I began to work through the experience. The therapy sessions were brutal. I had to relive every moment, every sensation, every terror. But gradually, I started to reclaim my life from the nightmare. I started to separate the memory from the present reality. I was alive, I was safe, I was not in that casket anymore. One of the hardest parts was dealing with my changed relationship with my own body. I had been betrayed by it, trapped inside it while it failed to respond to my desperate attempts at control. I had to learn to trust it again, to believe that it would obey me, that it wouldn't lock me inside again. Every time I felt tired or weak, panic would set in. What if it was happening again? What if I was slipping back into that state? Dr. Chen assured me that with proper treatment for the autoimmune disorder and careful monitoring, the likelihood of another cataleptic episode was minimal. But fear isn't rational, and it took months of work to quiet that panic when it arose. My family struggled too, in their own ways. My mother became almost obsessively protective, afraid to let me out of her sight, constantly checking that I was breathing, that I was responsive. My father threw himself into researching catalepsy, as if understanding it intellectually could somehow prevent it from happening again. He funded research into the condition, helped establish a foundation to raise awareness about the dangers of misdiagnosed death, and pushed for changes in medical protocols to prevent similar tragedies. James and I went to couples therapy. The experience had traumatized him almost as much as it had traumatized me. He had said goodbye to me, had mourned me, had started the painful process of moving on. Now I was back, but we were both changed. We had to rebuild our relationship, to learn to be together again, to trust in a future that we both now understood was fragile and uncertain. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of what we had been through threatened to crush us. But there were also moments of profound connection, of gratitude for second chances, of appreciation for the simple miracle of being together. The wedding we had been planning before my illness was postponed indefinitely. Neither of us could face the thought of a big celebration, of standing in front of people and making promises about forever when we had been so brutally reminded of how quickly forever can be stolen. Instead, 6 months after my recovery began, we had a small, private ceremony in our garden, with just our immediate family and, of course, Thomas. The garden had become my sanctuary during recovery. Thomas had taught me even more about plants, about their resilience, their ability to survive harsh conditions, to go dormant and return, to adapt and overcome. I found parallels to my own experience in every flower that bloomed, every seed that sprouted. Nature became my therapist in a way, showing me that survival was possible, that life finds a way even in the darkest circumstances. Thomas and I spent hours together in that garden. He never treated me like a victim or an invalid. He treated me like his student again, like the curious 13-year-old girl who had wanted to learn about photosynthesis and root systems. He taught me about the Victorian practice of safety coffins, invented specifically because of the fear of being buried alive. He showed me that my nightmare, while rare, was a fear that had haunted humanity for centuries. Knowing I wasn't alone in that fear, that others had survived it and gone on to live full lives, helped more than any medication could. Have you ever had an experience that completely changed how you view life, that made you reevaluate everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world? That's where I was. Everything looked different now. Colors seemed brighter because I had almost never seen them again. Food tasted more intense because I had come so close to never tasting anything again. The sound of rain, the feeling of wind on my face, the simple act of breathing freely, all of it became precious in a way it had never been before. My relationship with my own mortality changed fundamentally. Before my illness, death was an abstract concept, something that happened to other people, something far in the future that I didn't need to think about. Now it was intimate and immediate. I had touched it, been embraced by it, nearly been claimed by it. But instead of making me fearful, it made me determined. I had been given a second chance, a gift that not everyone receives, and I was not going to waste it. I started speaking publicly about my experience, first at medical conferences where Dr. Chen invited me to share my story to help educate healthcare providers about catalepsy and the importance of thorough examination before death certification. Then I expanded to other venues, talking about trauma, survival, resilience, and the importance of trusting instincts even when they contradict expert opinion. Thomas's role in my survival became a central part of these talks. I wanted people to understand that expertise is valuable, but it's not infallible. That sometimes the person with the least credentials but the most careful observation can see what everyone else misses. That we should create space for dissenting voices, especially in matters of life and death. I advocated for changes in death certification protocols, for mandatory waiting periods before burial, for better training in recognizing catalepsy and other conditions that can mimic death. Some of these initiatives were successful. Several medical schools now include case studies about catalepsy in their curriculum, using my experience as a teaching tool. Some jurisdictions implemented longer waiting periods before burial and required multiple physicians to certify death. It wasn't enough to prevent every possible case, but it was something. It was progress born from my nightmare, meaning extracted from trauma. The foundation my father established grew into a significant organization, funding research into rare neurological conditions, supporting survivors of medical trauma, and advocating for patient rights. I became actively involved, channeling my experience into helping others who had faced similar horrors. We heard from people around the world who had been misdiagnosed, who had woken up in morgues or funeral homes, who had been saved at the last moment like I was. Each story reinforced how crucial Thomas's intervention had been, how easily I could have become just another tragic statistic. On the first anniversary of my near burial, my family held a small ceremony in the garden. It wasn't a celebration exactly, more of an acknowledgement. We planted a tree, a flowering cherry that Thomas selected, in honor of the day I was given back my life. As we stood around that sapling, taking turns shoveling earth around its roots, I was struck by the symbolism. This tree would grow, would bloom every spring, would stand as a living reminder that death is not always the end it appears to be, that sometimes what seems finished is just beginning. My mother spoke first, her voice steady now in a way it hadn't been for months. She talked about the agony of losing a child, even an adult child, and the overwhelming joy of getting that child back. She thanked Thomas, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, for his courage and his insight. My father talked about faith, about how his had been tested and ultimately strengthened by the experience. James talked about love, about how close he had come to losing it forever, and how he would never take it for granted again. When it was my turn, I found myself struggling for words. How do you summarize an experience like mine? How do you express the depth of terror and the height of gratitude that comes from being pulled from your own grave? I settled for simplicity. I died, I said. Or at least, everyone thought I did. And in that space between life and death, I learned what matters. Not wealth or status or plans for the future, but connection, love, and the courage to trust your instincts even when the world tells you you're wrong. Thomas gave me my life back. But more than that, he gave me a perspective on life that I never would have had otherwise. Every day is a gift. Every breath is a miracle. And every person who loves us enough to fight for us, to refuse to give up on us, to trust their gut even when it's terrifying to do so, is a treasure beyond measure. Thomas, humble as always, tried to deflect the attention, but I wouldn't let him. I had commissioned a bench to be placed in the garden, with a plaque that read, "In honor of Thomas Bennett, who knew the difference between dormant and dead, and had the courage to act on that knowledge. With eternal gratitude, Catherine." He cried when he saw it. This man who had stayed strong through the chaos of stopping a funeral, who had stood firm in the face of anger and disbelief, finally allowing himself to feel the weight of what he had done and what it meant. We all cried that day, but they were good tears, cleansing tears, tears that washed away some of the trauma and left room for healing and hope. The second year after my recovery was easier than the first, and the third easier still. The nightmares became less frequent, the panic attacks more manageable. I learned to live with the experience rather than being consumed by it. I returned to some semblance of normal life, though I would never be quite the same person I was before. How could I be? I had been to the edge of death and back, had experienced the ultimate loss of control and the miraculous restoration of it. That kind of experience changes you at a fundamental level, reshapes your priorities, rewrites your understanding of what matters. James and I had our first child 3 years after the incident, a daughter we named Hope. The pregnancy was carefully monitored, every appointment filled with both anticipation and anxiety. What if the stress triggered another episode? What if I passed the condition on to my child? Dr. Chen assured us that the autoimmune disorder was manageable with medication and that the likelihood of passing on a predisposition to catalepsy was minimal. But fear doesn't listen to statistics. When Hope was born, healthy and screaming with strong lungs, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't known I was missing. This was life continuing, moving forward, refusing to be defined by past trauma. Holding her in my arms, feeling her warmth, her tiny fingers gripping mine, I was overwhelmed with gratitude. Not just for her existence, but for my own. I was here to hold my daughter because Thomas had refused to let them bury me. Every milestone she reached, every smile, every word, every step, was a gift I might never have received. As Hope grew, I wondered how I would tell her my story. How do you explain to your child that you were once buried alive, that you nearly died before she was ever conceived, that a gardener's instinct was all that stood between existence and non-existence? I decided early on that I would tell her when she was old enough to understand, because my story was also her story. It was the story of how fragile life is, how precious, how worth fighting for. It was the story of how sometimes the most important voice in the room is the one everyone else wants to silence. It was the story of trusting your instincts, standing up for what you believe even when it's terrifying, and never ever giving up on someone you think might still have a chance. Thomas continued to work in our gardens, though we had long since made it clear he could retire with full benefits anytime he wanted. He said the garden needed him, but we knew the truth. The garden was his purpose, his joy, his meditation. He loved the work, loved nurturing life, loved seeing things grow and bloom under his care. Hope adored him from the moment she was old enough to toddle around the garden. He taught her the same lessons he had taught me, about patience and observation, about the cycles of growth and dormancy, about how to tell when something needs water or sunlight or simply time to rest. Watching them together, I was reminded of the beautiful continuity of life, how knowledge and wisdom pass from generation to generation, how a man who saved my life was now enriching my daughter's life with his gentle teaching and profound understanding of the natural world. On Hope's 5th birthday, she asked me why there was a bench with Mr. Thomas's name on it in the garden. I sat down with her on that very bench and told her a simplified version of my story. I told her that sometimes people make mistakes, even smart people like doctors, and that Mr. Thomas had noticed a mistake that saved my life. I told her that because of his bravery and his careful watching, I was here to be her mommy. She processed this in the way children do, with a mix of curiosity and acceptance. Then she said something that brought tears to my eyes. So Mr. Thomas is kind of like my hero too, because without him, I wouldn't have you. Yes, I told her. Yes, exactly that. As the years passed and hope grew, I continued my advocacy work, my speaking engagements, my involvement with the foundation. The story of my near burial became less raw, more refined in the telling, but it never lost its power. Audiences were captivated by the horror of it, inspired by the survival, moved by Thomas's role in my rescue. I met other survivors, people who had been misdiagnosed, who had woken up in morgues or on autopsy tables, who had been saved by alert funeral home workers or observant family members. Each story reinforced the same truth. Death is not always what it appears to be, and we must be vigilant, careful, and willing to question even the most authoritative pronouncements when something doesn't feel right. The medical community, to their credit, took these stories seriously. Protocols improved, training enhanced, awareness raised. It would never be perfect. The human body is too complex and mysterious for perfection, but it got better. Fewer people would suffer what I suffered because of the lessons learned from my experience, and others like it. That gave me purpose, gave meaning to the trauma. I wasn't just a victim of a rare condition. I was a voice for change, an advocate for the vulnerable, a reminder that vigilance saves lives. On the 10th anniversary of my near burial, we held a larger celebration. Thomas was 70 now, still working in the gardens, though at a gentler pace. Hope was a bright, curious 10-year-old who knew my story well and had become something of a junior advocate herself, giving presentations at her school about the importance of trusting your instincts and speaking up when you see something wrong. The celebration brought together everyone who had been part of my journey: the doctors who had treated me, the therapists who had helped me heal, the family who had supported me, and most importantly, Thomas, the gardener who had saved my life. We gathered in the garden, surrounded by flowers and trees that Thomas had nurtured over the years, and I gave a speech that I had been preparing in my head for months. I talked about the journey from that terrible day to this celebration, about the growth and healing, about the purpose I had found in advocacy and education, but mostly I talked about gratitude. Gratitude for Thomas's courage, for my family's love, for the medical professionals who had helped me recover, for every breath I had taken in the 10 years since I had almost lost the ability to breathe forever. I announced that the foundation was establishing a scholarship in Thomas's name for students studying horticulture, botany, or any field related to the careful observation of life. Because Thomas had taught me that sometimes the most important skills aren't learned in universities but developed through years of patient attention to the world around us, through the humility to trust what you see even when others tell you you're wrong, through the courage to speak up even when you're afraid. Thomas, of course, tried to protest this honor, claiming he had just done what anyone would do. But we all knew better. Not everyone would have had his knowledge, his observational skills, his courage, or his compassion. He was unique, and his contribution to my life and the lives of everyone who loved me deserved recognition. As the sun set over the garden that evening, I found myself standing by the cherry tree we had planted 10 years earlier. It was magnificent now, its branches spreading wide, its trunk strong and steady. Every spring, it erupted in clouds of pink blossoms, a yearly reminder of renewal and second chances. Hope came to stand beside me, slipping her hand into mine. "Mom," she said, "do you still get scared about what happened?" I thought about how to answer honestly, but age-appropriately. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Sometimes I have bad dreams, or I feel panicky for no reason. But mostly, I feel grateful. Because that scary thing that happened to me also taught me how precious life is, how much people love me, and how important it is to notice things and speak up when something seems wrong." She nodded, processing this. Then she said, "I'm glad Mr. Thomas noticed. I'm glad you're here." "Me too, sweetheart," I said, squeezing her hand. "Me too." Looking back now, from the vantage point of someone who survived the unsurvivable, I can see the patterns in my story that weren't visible when I was living through it. I can see how my illness was a wake-up call, not just about my health, but about my life. I had been drifting, going through the motions of privilege, planning a future without really thinking about what I wanted that future to be. The cataleptic episode, as traumatic as it was, forced me to reevaluate everything, to choose consciously how I wanted to live rather than just accepting the path that had been laid out for me. I became more involved in charitable work, more conscious of how I used my wealth and privilege, more aware of the people around me and their struggles. I developed deeper relationships with people I had previously taken for granted, including my parents, whose devotion during my illness showed me just how much I was loved. I learned to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to admit when I was struggling instead of maintaining the perfect facade that wealth and breeding had taught me to present to the world. Most importantly, I learned the value of every single day. Not in a cliche way, but in a deep, bone-level understanding that this moment, right now, is all we're guaranteed. Tomorrow is a maybe, next week is a hope, next year is a dream. But right now, this breath, this heartbeat, this moment of connection with another human being, this is real and precious and deserving of our full attention and appreciation. Have you ever thought about what you would do differently if you were given a second chance at life? I don't mean in a hypothetical way. I mean really thought about it, imagined it, felt the weight of that question. I've lived it. And I can tell you that the answer is both simpler and more profound than you might think. You would pay attention. You would notice things. You would tell people you love them. You would take risks that matter and avoid risks that don't. You would stop waiting for the perfect moment because you would understand that there is no perfect moment. There's only now, and now is slipping away even as we try to hold on to it. So here I am, 15 years after the day I almost died, sharing my story with you because I believe it matters. I believe that somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that survival is possible, that trauma can be transformed, that second chances do exist even when everything seems lost. I believe that someone needs to understand the importance of trusting their instincts, of speaking up even when it's uncomfortable, of paying attention to the details that everyone else overlooks. Maybe you're that person. Maybe you've been through your own trauma, your own near-death experience, your own moment when everything changed. Or maybe you're facing a situation right now where you know something is wrong, but everyone else is telling you you're mistaken. Maybe you need permission to trust yourself, to be the Thomas in someone else's story, to refuse to go along with the consensus when your gut tells you something different. I'm here to give you that permission. Trust yourself. Trust your observations. Trust your instincts. Yes, experts are important. Yes, education and training matter. But sometimes the most crucial information comes from careful attention, from years of observation, from a willingness to see what is actually there rather than what we expect to see. Thomas saw me, really saw me, when everyone else saw only a corpse. His vision saved my life, and I spent every day since trying to honor that gift by truly seeing the world around me, by paying attention, by trusting what I observe even when it contradicts what I'm told. This is what I want to leave you with. Life is fragile and precious and more mysterious than we usually acknowledge. Death is not always what it appears to be, but neither is life. We drift through our days half asleep, assuming tomorrow will come, assuming we have time, assuming the people we love will always be there. And then something happens, a crisis, a loss, a near miss, and suddenly we're awake. Suddenly we see clearly. Suddenly we understand what we've been taking for granted. Don't wait for that crisis to wake you up. Wake up now. Look at your life with fresh eyes. Notice the people who love you, the opportunities you have, the moments of beauty and connection that happen every single day if you're paying attention. Tell people they matter to you. Take the risks that align with your values. Stop waiting for permission to live the life you want to live. And if you find yourself in a position like Thomas was, where you see something everyone else is missing, where you know something is wrong even though the experts disagree, have the courage to speak up. Yes, you might be wrong. Yes, you might face criticism or ridicule. But what if you're right? What if your voice, your observation, your willingness to cause a scene could save someone's life? Isn't that worth the risk of embarrassment? I owe my life to a man who was willing to take that risk, who valued my potential survival over his own comfort and reputation. I've tried to pay that forward by advocating for others, by sharing my story, by encouraging people to trust themselves and speak up. But I can't reach everyone, and my voice is just one voice. You have a voice too. You have instincts, observations, knowledge that no one else has. Don't keep it to yourself out of fear or uncertainty. Share it. Speak it. Let it be heard. You might save someone's life. You might change someone's trajectory. You might be the difference between a tragedy and a miracle. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced something that completely changed your perspective on life? Have you ever been in a position where you had to trust your instincts over expert opinion? Have you ever been given a second chance? Or have you given one to someone else? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience matters, and someone out there needs to hear it. Understanding these experiences, learning from them, connecting over them, this is how we build a community of awareness and support. This is how we ensure that fewer people suffer the kind of trauma I endured. This is how we honor the people like Thomas who see what others miss and have the courage to act on that vision. If my story touched your heart, if it made you think differently about life and death and the precious nature of every moment, please leave a like on this video. It helps more people find this story, helps spread awareness about catalepsy and misdiagnosed death, helps build a community of people who understand that life is fragile and worth fighting for. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of survival and resilience and the extraordinary things ordinary people do when faced with impossible situations, please subscribe to I Live to Tell. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Because every story shared is a life honored, a lesson learned, a connection made. We're all in this together, navigating this strange and beautiful and terrifying experience of being alive. And sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is share our truths with each other, to say, this happened to me and I survived, and here's what I learned. Thank you for listening to my story, for being part of this community, for caring enough to hear about the day I died, and the gardener who refused to let me stay dead. Thank you for being here, for being alive, for being willing to pay attention to the world around you. Every single one of you matters. Every story you have deserves to be told, and every day you wake up is a gift, whether or not you've ever been buried alive to prove it. Live like you know that. Live like every moment counts. Because it does. They all do. See you in the next story.